So welcome everybody to the Future of Snap session, otherwise known as the, um, is this going to work? One of these things has to work. What is the Future of Snap session? Because we started talking about it and weren't quite sure what we wanted to say, except we all agreed on saying this. We are not promising to do anything in particular, and definitely not promising to do anything at any particular time. If you have questions during the discussion, please ask them in the chat and we'll do our best with them. Okay, next point. Yesterday there was a teacher panel about what teachers needed from us, and there were a few things that a bunch of people wanted. One is auto-saving, another is folders, keeping old versions of projects, and backpack a la Scratch. And no promises, but we hear that you want those things and we're gonna do our best to make you happy as best we can. So the big thing that we've been discussing among ourselves lately is this whole idea of restricted environments. From the very, very beginning of BYOB, teachers have been asking to be able to remove things from the environment for their students, either because they want to pose a problem in which you're only allowed to use these 6 blocks, or because they think such and such a feature is too complicated for their students. And we used to just say no to that because we, as it says here, we saw that as being too authoritarian, and we have more faith in kids than the people asking for those things have. And we've come around a little bit on that, partly because of Paul Goldenberg, who has a very unusual use of SNAP. He's not teaching programming or computer science. He's teaching math, and he's teaching it to very young kids. And for very young kids, the argument about cognitive load and not having so much going on makes a little more sense than for teenagers. And also, maybe even more important, Paul isn't teaching programming. When you're teaching programming, we feel like having a restricted language is like teaching programming with one hand tied behind your back. But when it's not programming, but math that you're teaching, there's no need for it to look like a programming language at all. So we've supported that work. The EDC team did a workshop about it Friday. Other than that, as you know, we have added the ability to hide primitive blocks a long time ago, and to hide custom blocks in the newest development version. But the compromise is we've also made it possible for students to unhide them. So it's okay, we're helping you play this game where students have a restricted language, but we're not going to participate in making the students feel like they're not in control of their own environment by letting them escape from that world if they want to. And we're not sure, how much more of this we're going to do. So for example, we just added the ability to hide custom blocks, not for the sake of giving kids a restricted environment, but really for the sake of the Colors and Crayons library, which has something like 30 or 40 blocks in it, of which 9 of them are the ones we actually want users to use. And so it was just way too complicated what people saw about it. So this is one of the reasons that we changed the title from The Future to What is the Future, because it's something we're not sure about ourselves. That's still under discussion. Kind of behind that discussion, by the way, other presenters, just jump in and interrupt me when you feel like it. I'm doing all this talking because I made the slide deck. Behind the question of restricted environments is the question of for whom are we writing Snap altogether? Who do we want to design for? And so the obvious answer, the one that really started the project from Berkeley's perspective, was students in computer science classes. So that's definitely one of the answers. I'm a big fan of 12-year-olds. Every so often, some 12-year-old turns up on the forum who knows more than I do about lambda calculus or something. And that's just great. So they're part of my preferred audience. Scratch-aged kids, meaning, single-digit age kids, if they're part of the audience, well, Scratch itself has done a lot of simplifying. From the very beginning, they decided to leave some things out, like the ability to make custom blocks. And it took them a while to implement lists in the language. But in 3.0, they actually removed a whole bunch of capabilities and moved them into extensions, like the whole turtle graphics capability is now a Scratch extension. So for their age group, there's maybe more pressure to leave things out. And that's why this slide is related to the previous one. Teachers. Everybody's going to throw tomatoes at me, but kids are a lot smarter than adults. A lot of the time when I hear about cognitive load, I feel like it's the adults who have this problem rather than the kids. But teachers are an important part of our audience, and we have to make sure to meet their needs, not only qua teachers, but qua just users. Right, so the teachers have to start by themselves being Snap users. And then developers that's an audience that really wants much more sophisticated development tools. So Bernat was talking earlier about things like improving debugging aids. And that's much more a feature for ourselves than for anybody else. Not that debugging isn't important for all those other people also, but we certainly are part of our own audience. Okay. Michael, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, and I guess before we go on, if you want to go back to the previous slide, I think the one thing that's worth thinking about is this list is not strictly a priority order list. I think the five of us have sort of different, visions of where we would prioritize that. This probably roughly aligns if we were forced to pick and choose. But I also think it sort of just helps us solidify when we run into issues where we think about ranking them, and who's going to need those features the most. Because certainly kids who discover Snap and Scratch at the beginning are not the group that needs folders, but we're also all here the group that needs folders. So I think just thinking about that as everything that we need to build kind of plays into it. But yeah, if you want to go on to trade-offs. Is there anything on the slide or?
Oh, that's it.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that, so maybe for some context, when Brian said, we decided to kind of frame the panel as more of a question, we spent an hour and a half to 2 hours a couple nights ago just talking about, how we approach building things. And I think it's worth just remembering that in the same way that we don't want to restrict the environment, we also don't want an environment that is Internet Explorer from 2003, where 50% of your screen is taken up with toolbars and every possible function that you could imagine doing as well. And so, when we have such this diverse set of audiences, how do we think about who fits in there? And I think for us, Snap, the editor, has this tension between tons of powerful functionality and context menus. And we all know that context menus are not, the best interface for discovering functions. Until I guess Snap 6, the search blocks function was only accessible via a keyboard shortcut and not necessarily a search icon was there at the beginning. And I think that was a reasonable trade-off. Now you can click it. That's good. It works for everyone. But all these sort of features, fall into that system. And Brian and I have had discussions about folders as an example too, where we have collections because they're a way to share projects, not co-ownership yet, but with a private group of people. But folders accomplish this, and now we have two systems on a cloud backend that are similar but different. And so I think for all of these things, it's just a question of, as we build features, and especially as most of us have a job that is not primarily building Snap, how we support building those things. And so I think for us too, and talking about the community, one of the things is focusing not just on what are the things that we want to do, but what are the problems that we are unable to accomplish within the current limitations of our system. And so that's where things that we know are high on our priorities list, but sometimes harder, or sharing, auto-saving, version history, because they're things that you just can't accomplish in some other way in certain cases. And so, but I think that's how I'd say we approach this. Really, what are we really almost unable to do by a lack of some feature, and then if we enable some new feature, who are really going to be able to take advantage of that, and how do we make sure that it's something that is really the right thing for that set of users. I think to Brian's point, this is where most of us being far removed from being students can be really hard to distinguish just the needs of what a student would be from a teacher would be. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not, and that's just something that I think we constantly have come up in our discussions. Yeah, that's really all I think I have to say about that, but others should feel free to chime in. And just as a reminder, I don't think we're going to be if others have questions or ideas in the chat, I think that's going to be the main way that we're going to take ideas. So if you're thinking about something that you want us to address later, building up sort of a queue of those, it would be a good way to approach this.
Okay, me. Jadga, could you put it in the chat so we can have this part first and then deal with that stuff, other people's stuff.
Okay.
So, I want to talk about macros. This is my favorite missing feature. Basically, a macro is a program that creates programs, and this picture shows a block called make ordinals. And you give it as input a list of names, first, second, third, and so on. And it creates 10 new blocks in the palette. So there's fourth there as an example. So this particular macro is kind of a block factory. But there are other things too that you can use macros for, but what they all have in common is that they manipulate code itself and generate new code and examine existing code. And one reason it's important to me, that maybe not to anybody else, is it's the last thing that stops us being a complete implementation of Scheme, which is, God's programming language. We've been working on being a Scheme for a long time. That's why we have call with continuation. But also it's useful for development and for more advanced users. And this is an example of supporting 12-year-olds, by the way. It's those 12-year-olds who are going to love this. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a big deal. Jens, you want to tell us about scenes?
Yeah, scenes is something that Jadga and I have been talking about for a long time, and already kind of shown the prototype that you all can play with when we opened SnapCon, and it kind of has the same trade-off discussions that we're having here. So we've seen what Wolfgang does in Catrobat, and we liked it, and we've seen how users love it, and we've talked about it a lot. And at first it sounded like an easy idea, and when I started out actually getting it done, I thought, like, this is really going to be very simple. And I think I even remember an interaction with Roger Wagner a year ago, where he kind of said, this is just add more stages, and then everything will be fine. And so turns out that there are all these things that we don't know. So we've been looking into things like HyperCard, which has been sort of a beacon of things where you can just exponentially have a more useful program if you have more programs and just put them into a stack of cards. But then all these questions arise, and Brian and I have talked about this a lot. Like, what should be the structure? Should it be one level, just a flat list? Should there be hierarchies among the scenes? Should there be scenes off scenes? Should it be a tree or a network? And I think the guiding principle here for us as we're thinking about this feature, and it really relates to many other features too, is like, there's always, these things come at a cost. Like when you add a feature that sounds like a great idea, it comes at the cost, and the cost is often cognitive load, as Michael said. Like, you have more buttons, you have more items in the context menu. And for a beginner, such a feature can be a burden, because you see all these things. You might see them in other projects, and you might be confused, like, do I have to use this to do something? So we're always kind of trying to make them with as little cognitive footprint, if you will. And those are kind of the things we're talking about here. It actually was surprisingly hard to implement them. Like, the changes were surprisingly a lot. Like, there were more changes in there than in the Morphic 2 re-architecture we did last year. And I guess, so we're just now at the stage where we're seriously discussing how they should work. This is one of the reasons why we didn't rush to a release before the conference.
Okay, who's going to take this one? Extensions. So we've been talking about how to make it possible for the sort of spin-offs of Snap really to stay connected to Snap, so that when we release a new version, everybody gets it automatically. That's sort of the goal here.
So
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think there's a few things that came about with this, which is it may not be clear to everyone here, but we have our own Snap Cloud. That part I think is clear. But Bernat's version of leading the Snap Cloud was built originally for BeetleBlocks and a version of that snap cloud exists for turtle stitch, and each of them has their own sort of flavor and community behind them as well. But we also have a whole bunch of shared projects that, in a larger sense, the existing, if we're talking about what's limiting about our current system, I think one thing that we kind of think is limiting is we really have not just one big Snap community, but a Snap community, a NetsBlocks community, a Turtle Stitch community, a BeetleBlocks community that are all, related and friendly with each other. But how can we make sure that over time, as you're learning, one language or what seems like one language, you really have the ability to move back and forth between things. So part of this is not just a technical function of how we, how we actually build an interface to extend Snap, but how we include people and include projects in the community. And so many interesting Snap projects that exist in this world that have been built by other faculty members and grad students are stuck on things like Snap 4 and Snap 5 and haven't been brought forward. So and have functions in them that make them incompatible with our current community sites. And so the goal there is to really bring that forward. A lot of this also was sort of came to a head when we sort of had the first case of a student really trying to export or exploit JavaScript function for something malicious. It was one of those things that we honestly knew was possible for a while, but until it happens, we can kind of get the benefits of living in the easy world when servers didn't always have so much security and two-factor wasn't a thing. But now that we have that need for locking things down, the goal has been, how do we build an extensions mechanism which is secure by default, something where the 5 of us can, and hopefully we can grow this team, but actually keep sort of a sense of what's out there and enable people to build Snap extensions, and then for users to run them, import them, and use them securely without having to worry about checking a checkbox that says this could do something dangerous. And so that's really been the philosophy. If you saw Bernat's project last night when we were in, or yesterday afternoon, whichever time zone you're in, where he extended Snap using the new extensions mechanism just by importing a couple JavaScript libraries, added a few parameters to some blocks. That's sort of the technical side, but the idea is similar to Brian and Akash's view for NetsBlocks. How can we have a few really key functions that exist that let you do some of the most common ways of extending and modifying Snap without it being rewrite this entire editor, host it somewhere else, and have your own secondary storage system. So that's the goal and hope behind that. And it'll be a continual work in progress, I think. But maybe, I don't know if Bernat or others want to share other things.
So I guess maybe we should talk about sort of what the framework looks like to an extension writer. Right? So part of it's an API, right? That we publish certain entry points into the Snap code. Is there more than that?
I mean, so for those who are curious, I will drop the API document that currently exists in the chat. I think that, that is largely, well, I think there's 2 versions in the way that we're thinking about this. Is there are a set of hidden primitives in the current version 7 development branch that you can just use without writing any JavaScript code. So some of the things that we routinely built to use in our own libraries, a more advanced function of HTTP get or just HTTP requests in general, not just gets. Something where we can expose a primitive, or we can expose a block default in Snap, a get URL block that's very simple, something you don't need to think about, but allow you to then build a customized version for a project that works with some external service without having to re-import a library or enable JavaScript. So some of those are just things that you'll build upon right in Snap. There'll be things like hiding and showing variables and blocks will likely be one of the interfaces for that. So giving sort of project authors a little bit more control over what gets shown in an easier way. And then the meat of an extension, if you want to really sort of go out, would be to load some custom JavaScript that would need to be approved, or that you would need to enable JavaScript for, but that can really pull in a library. So Bernat was using a WebRTC library to do speech communication the other day. At that point, basically anything is possible. But that's sort of the theory behind how those will work. But really, it's only a few new blocks with a big dropdown and a few different parameters. Not too dissimilar from what you might think of in Netsblox's RPC structure.
Yeah, I'm sort of chuckling at a few blocks because back in the early days, we were very proud that we only added 8 blocks to Scratch. And since then, it's grown a little more. Yeah.
Which kind of brings up the point about hiding some of those again. That's really the tension, right? I mean, that's the tension where when we're teaching computing and we're doing this in sort of a general purpose programming language that is kind of really grown out of a DSL for little games. And so we're adding features to make ideas that we love accessible, like, wow, here's something you can do with your picture. Here's something you can do by recording a voice. And in doing that, you kind of in a playful way, you can learn something about data science or even linear algebra. But then, of course, it's in there. And so people who kind of want to use it the old way, just make little cheesy cartoonish games, also have these features. And that increases the need for education, documentation. Thank you, Brian, for all the documentation. But it also forces us, or kind of teachers, kind of results in a problem for teachers that they have to say, don't look at this. You're not going to need this. And so it's sort of a strange thing that's happening, that as we're introducing these features, we have to introduce more features that'll again hide them.
Okay, new topic. Partly the future of Snap is up to you guys. Again, from yesterday's teacher panel, everybody wanted more and more different kinds of documentation. And that's a way in which anybody can contribute. It doesn't have to be us. Not that we don't want to do it at all, but we're never going to have as many tutorials as people want. So, please, by all means, make tutorials, throw them on YouTube, whatever. So that's something where we're definitely asking for help. And another thing that we're kind of interested in help about is the online community. So we have featured projects. We have collections by theme, an art collection and a physics collection and so on. We recently have the topic of the month, although we've been bad about making one happen every month. And eventually people are going to be able to make comments on each other's projects. There's also the forum, People ask for help. People get teams together to work on things. People report bugs. Kids make tutorials in the forum, sometimes in the form of tutorial projects, which is great. People talk about some fairly sophisticated ideas in computer science and things like that. The community only works if there's a lot of attention paid to it. This is really one of the things that I know I have most strongly learned from Scratch. You know, Scratch as a language is pretty cool, but the Scratch community is amazingly cool. And it's because they have, you know, half a dozen to a dozen people working on making it amazingly cool. So we don't have in mind a specific mechanism for sort of growing the moderation team. Moderation, the word moderation suggests kind of a negative connotation that the job is about squishing bad things. But it's not just that at all. It's also mentoring kids, you know, inventing topics of the month, all of the stuff that happens. And that's the thing that there really aren't enough of us to work on. Scratch has a lot of money. We don't. So we need support from you guys. Okay, now I'm going to stop screen sharing while we look at the chat.
Yeah. So one thing I think, you know, on sort of just that call as well of for help about documentation, tutorials and things as well, is that some of this is, you know, if there's a place where you would like to see something, you know, it also means that, you know, we don't have to be the only ones to collect it. If you have an idea where